Catholic Apologetics Today, Answers to Modern Critics, by Father William G. Most. Part 1. Chapter 1, For Openers. How do some people come to have faith? Do they just decide to believe without any reason for believing, as if they took a leap and jumped up into a cloud? If so, then their faith would have had a solid foundation as a cloud. That method is not for a rational person. It is for such unreasonable and unreasoning ones as Kierkegaard, the Danish existentialist, who says faith is precisely a leap. Or Bultmann, grandfather of form criticism, thinks that if even sinful to want to have any basis for faith, says Bultmann, the man of faith, has nothing in his hand which to base his faith. He is suspended in midair. The Catholic Church does not ask for or even permit such unreasonable thinking. Vatican Council I, quoting Romans 12:1, taught that our faith should be a reasonable service of God, not an irrational leap. The first epistle of St. Peter says the same. Always be ready to give a defense to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. So we are going to start out on a search. There will be two stages. First reason, then faith. That is, before anyone can or should believe, you should go through a process of discovery based on reason, not on faith. We will face all problems squarely, including the fact that some today deny God, deny miracles, and even, believe it or not, deny the very possibility of writing any reliable history. Only after the necessary preliminaries will we look for the rational foundations for faith. After this basic work, we will consider the claims of other religions, including Protestantism, Judaism, and non-Christian religions. Finally, in the appendices, we will answer objections about specific teachings of the Church. Chapter 2, Causes of Teenage Doubt. Although written for the young, others will find this chapter valuable for their own information, or to use the data to help a young person who does not have an opportunity to read this. The strange phenomenon appears in most young people, sometimes near the end of high school. It starts then and lasts varying lengths of time, sometimes for years, and is of varying severity. The symptoms: the young person finds his formerly solid religious beliefs beginning to wobble. He is no longer sure of them, and he is hesitant to look for an older person, for he is definitely inclined not to trust the opinions of any older person. So he is forced to be miserable all by himself, unless, of course, he talks to others of the same age and finds them in the same quandary, but equally without any way to get out. We said the length of time this trouble lasts is varying. Some never fully emerge from it. That brings us to see the first of the reasons for the problem. When we were children, we simply believed what older people told us. Really, that is all that could be done at an early age. But then as we grow up, we want to know for ourselves, to be able to give a reason for what we believe. This process is not quite normal. It could even be a good thing, provided that it is carried all the way to its conclusion. If not, a person may lack stability indefinitely, perhaps for the rest of his life. This process is, then, the normal changeover from the child of the adult pattern of beliefs. It is proper because adults should not act like children and should be able to give a reason for their beliefs. No one can be quite comfortable between the shore of childhood belief and the shore of solidly grounded adult faith. For there one is neither fish nor fowl. He lacks both kinds of security, and so he flounders. Eventually he may just give up trying, but yet never achieve the solidity he reasonably wants. Worse, if some great test of faith comes, he may not have a solid basis for which to endure. Obviously, The rational thing for a young or even older person to do in such a quandary is to ask for help from those who are able to give it. Sadly, this is not so often done. First, the young persons are disinclined to think older persons could possibly know anything. In fact, many older persons never completed the rational process themselves and are really no position to help. There is a second very potent reason for this at-sea condition. Young people are apt to have their somatic resonance in a state of flux. Somatic resonance is a common term in psychology. It is not hard to understand. A major psychologist for our times, T.V. Moore, told in his last book of a case when he met a practicing psychiatrist in Washington, D.C. A patient came in for help who suffered from manic depressive psychosis. He told Dr. Moore he was losing his faith. Moore reported that the man was not really losing his faith. Instead, the process of the disease was interfering with the somatic resonance to faith. Here is the way it works. We are, of course, made up of body and soul, spirit and matter. These elements are so closely joined as to add up to one person. As a result of that union, we have condition on either side, body or soul, then for smooth running, not for mere survival of the condition. We ought to have a parallel condition on the other side. That parallel is called a resonance. When the resonance on the side of the body, the more common combination, then it is called somatic reason, from the Greek word meaning bodily.
So then, faith is obviously on the side of the spirit. But faith needs not for mere survival, but for normal function, a resonance on the bodily side. The process, probably bad biochemistry, of the disease in Moore's patient interfered with the somatic resonance to faith. The result was that faith was not rejected, but neither could it function normally. Hence, the poor man thought he was losing his faith. Now, young people can have a parallel problem. They enter a time of life where there are great bodily changes in the glandular system, especially the start of sexual functioning. They have not yet had time to learn to live with these changes, to come to terms with them. As a result, their somatic resonance to many things is in a state of flux. So the faith lacks its normal resonance. No wonder faith tends to wobble, to seem to have no foundation. Obviously, if a person could realize what is going on inside him and see that he is being hit by a dramatic changing progress, he would be very relieved. We do not say he would quickly find everything easily, but he could step outside himself and see himself objectively. Then at least he would not be so mystified by what he cannot help feeling. Two conditions have just explained are clearly part of the process of growing up. As such, they have always affected people, not just in our day, but today, young and old alike are affected by a third influence. The immense upheaval in the church and the many claims that everything has changed. It is no wonder that many are uncomfortable with their faith. So we are going to set out upon a search to prove that there is help. There is a solid, rational basis for faith. Chapter 3. Wonders never cease. It is impossible to use the electric light and wireless, and at the same time to believe in the New Testament world of spirits and miracles. The writer is one we have met before, R. Boltzmann, founder of the New Testament form criticism. Modern man is so sophisticated and smart, according to Boltzmann, he can no longer accept miracles. He explains a miracle, that is, an act of God, is not visible or ascertainable like worldly events. In fact, the conception of miracles as uncertainable process makes beliefs in miracles, or rather superstition, susceptible to the justifiable criticisms of science. Yet, on the other hand, he insists, when the world happenings are viewed as a closed series, there is certainly no room for any act of God. But this is just the paradox of faith. It understands an ascertainable event in its context in nature and history as an act of God. This is the only genuine faith in miracles. If the reader finds the above somewhat confusing, he is probably grasping Bultmann correctly. What Bultmann really says is that modern man is too smart to accept miracles. If science cannot explain something, it would be superstition to call it a miracle. But something science can explain can be a miracle. It is impossible to be more perverse. Really, Bultmann is showing the kind of faith we rejected in the opening chapter, a faith based on nothing at all, a faith as solid as a cloud. But we, on the other hand, insist on being rational. When we begin to study the Gospels, we will find accounts of miracles. So it is good to ask right now, can we believe in miracles? The answer is no, for we do not have to believe in miracles. Rather, we see and accept as a miracle something that has no other conceivable explanation but the hand of God. Did such things ever happen? The easiest way to find the answer is to ask, do they still happen? Let us proceed, therefore, and see. Madame Biret, a Frenchwoman, became blind in February 1908. Medical examination showed blindness was due to atrophy of the papilla. In other words, the optic nerve has withered at the point where it enters the eye. Obviously, there was organic reason for her blindness. No one can see with a withered optic nerve. She was taken to Lourdes, the great shrine at which it is reported the Blessed Virgin appeared in 1858. On August 5th, 1908, Madame Biret received Holy Communion at the Grotto of Lourdes. At 10 a.m., the priest who was carrying the Blessed Sacrament in procession passed beside her. Madame Biret at once saw the statue of the Blessed Virgin. She was taken at once to the Permanent Medical Bureau at Lourdes, where doctors are always available. In fact, any doctor, even an atheist, is permitted to go there and examine cases to his heart's content. One of these, Dr. Alexis Carroll, came to scoff but left a convert. Dr. Laney, an oculist, examined her. What he found was even more astonishing than a miraculous cure. She could read even the smallest letters of a newspaper, but the optic nerve was still withered. A month later, another eye examination by 3 specialists found that the nerve had been restored. No possible suggestion or any natural means can make a dead, withered optic nerve functional. In passing, we note that a case such as this is not only a miracle, it also proves the presence of Christ in the Blessed Sacrament, for it was when the host passed her that she was cured instantly. It also proves the claims of the Church with regard to the Eucharist, that is, the real presence of Christ, his body, blood, soul, and divinity. We often hear claims of cures by faith healers and similar persons, there is no careful checking on these, but some fakes have been detected. The supposed cures are generally maladies open to the power of suggestion. The mind can do remarkable things, but no one would dare to claim suggestion could restore a withered nerve. Some have proposed that Jesus, in his earthly life, worked miracles by suggestion, or even that he had found some marvelous natural means not known to others. The claims are false. First, he said he did things by the power of God. If it were merely by natural means, he would have been a liar and a fake. But his whole life, his lofty moral tone, and his teaching contradict that. And this cure of Madame Mireille, worked by his presence in the Blessed Sacrament, could not have been accomplished by natural means of any kind. For no natural process can make a nerve operative while still withered. Our next cases, too, are far beyond any natural process, as we shall see. Around 700 A.D., in the church of Saint Legonziano in Lanciano, Italy, a priest was celebrating Mass. He began to doubt the presence of Jesus in the host and the chalice. Then it happened. Most of the host changed to flesh. The center kept the appearance of bread, and the liquid in the chalice became 5 clots of blood. The treasure was guarded over the centuries by monks. Finally, in November 1970, the authorities of the church gave permission for a study. A team of biological and medical scientists gathered. They took small samples of the flesh and the blood and put them through a full battery of tests. They found that the flesh was really human flesh, a part of the heart, and the clots were human blood. The proteins in the blood were the normal ratio contained in fresh blood. Other features of the chemistry were normal. The type of blood in the clots was the same as the blood in the flesh. Yet, no trace of any preservative or embalming agent was found. Obviously, flesh and blood would ordinarily begin to decay in a day or two, yet after so many centuries and right up to today, they have not decayed. So now we ask Boltzmann, what natural law can change bread and wine into human flesh and blood and keep them without delay, without preservatives, for centuries, so that every scientific test can verify they really are human flesh and blood? Here is one more case. On December 9th, 1531, an Aztec Indian, Juan Diego, claimed he had seen the Virgin Mary in the countryside near Mexico City. He told his bishop, who was quite properly skeptical. The bishop told him that if it happened again to ask the Virgin Mary for a sign. On December 12th, she came again, and Juan did ask for a sign. She told him to pick some roses growing nearby, which ordinarily would not be found there in December. He put them into his cloak and went to see the bishop. But the bishop did not look at the flowers. He kept staring at the cloak. Juan had not noticed, but the cloak now held a large, full-color image of the apparition Juan had seen. On November 14th, 1921, a powerful bomb hidden in the vase of flowers was placed before the image. The bomb exploded and did extensive damage, heavily twisting the large metal crucifix, which I have myself had seen, but did not harm the image or the glass in front of it. In 1929, Alfonso Marquez Gonzalez was studying the image, and to his surprise he saw a picture of inside of the eyes. In 1956, two ophthalmologists, Dr. Hervé Torelio Bueno and Dr. Raphael Torrige Lavione confirmed that there was indeed an image in the eyes. The image follows the pattern of the Perkins law, that there should be a threefold reflection of in the normal eye, two right side up and one upside down. More recently, Dr. Jose Aste-Tansman, using a computer-enhanced images, found that at least four figures can be seen, one seeming to be an Indian peasant with hands lifted up in prayer. Dr. Aste believes it is Juan Diego. The image also shows a bearded Spaniard. Further extensive studies made by infrared and ultraviolet photography and by the microchemical analysis of fibers of pigments prove that some trimming have been added to the picture by human hands, but that the picture is totally inexplicable by science. No brush marks, no sizing on the cloth, no cracking of pigments, etc. The cloth itself should have decayed in 25 to 30 years from the time of the apparition. As we said, we should quite rationally claim that these events, which we do not believe, but rather see for ourselves, not only prove the existence of God, but prove the truth of the Catholic Church, which alone proclaims the real presence in the Eucharist and the dignity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. However, without in any way denying that the marvels do prove these things, we are going to put them aside and show still another way of establishing solid ground. Chapter 4. Is there a God? Is there a God? The scientifically checked miracles of Chapter 3 really answer this question, for as we have seen, God has made himself known by these miracles, as shown in his hand, as it were. Even so, it is worthwhile to look at a different kind of proof of his existence. First will come some preliminary proofs, then the clincher. There is a story. It may not be true, but it is a good illustration, even so that an atheist came to call astronomer friend. While waiting, he admired a clever mechanical model of the solar system. He pushed a button and each planet made to scale revolved in the right proportional rate. Astronomer came in and the atheist asked, "This is clever, who made it?" The astronomer replied, "No one." "But you are kidding." "No." "You think the real thing made itself? Why not this little model?" Again, a good mathematician could calculate the chances of one perfect human ear being formed merely by chance. Odds against it are astronomical. Consider then the chance of two ears developing at the same time, and with other working hands of a human too, such as human brain. Before birth, the brain develops hundreds of thousands of neurons each minute. Each neuron makes 1,000 to 10,000 synapses, connections, to a total of about 100 trillion synapses and about 100 billion neurons. Yet, no two neurons are identical in form. But they all so developed, but they all do develop and make the right connections to form one working human brain. Could they do it all on their own, without the help of a higher power? In addition, as we have said, there are really basically solid proofs of God's existence. We are going to examine the best form of proof twice. First, in the technical philosophical form, in which it has maximum power, but it is less easy to follow. Later we will repeat it in a looser but easier form and in popular language. The great Greek philosopher Aristotle made some remarkable discoveries. One of them was this, and it is so simple. If I am here and want to go to there, I must first have the capacity, then next I actually go. He named the first of these principles potency, or potentiality. The second act, or actualization, or perfection. They all mean the same. The truth is quite obvious. Perhaps we even would have seen it without his help, but now we need to notice something further. Not only when I travel from place to place, but also any time something moves or changes in any way, the same set of conditions must exist, namely, first, the capacity or potency for the move or change, second, the fulfillment or act. We notice, too, that whenever there is a rise from potency to act, new higher perfection or being appears. Before, there was only a possibility or capacity or potency afterwards. When that possibility or potency got its fulfillment, there is an improvement. There is a new being or higher being as a result. But I cannot give myself what I do not have. If I do not have $1,000, I cannot give myself $1,000. I must get it from elsewhere. Therefore, when this rise takes place from potency to act, where does the extra come from? It might, in some cases, come from a different part of me, if I am the one in which this rise takes place. But if so, where did the other part get the added perfection, or how to get up from potency to act? It had to come from somewhere, at least eventually. That means from some being outside me. As you will see, we have not solved the problem yet, for we must still ask another question. Where did that outside being get the perfection? How did it move from potency to act? Will the problem go away if we suppose that there is a long chain of beings, each moving the other from potency to act? No, the problem is still with us, as long as we have beings that need help to get from potency to act. It is only when we come to a being that does not need help that we get an answer. That being is what Aristotle calls the first cause, or God. And the first cause is pure act with no potency or potentiality mixed in. Let us use a comparison. No comparison is perfect, and neither is this one, but it will help. Suppose we take a playing card and try to stand it on its edge or on a slant of the top of the table. Of course, it needs support, so we put another card behind it at the same angle as a prop. But then that too needs a prop, and so on and so on. No matter how many cards we put there in the same way, there is no solution to the problem. Instead, the problem gets worse. There are more cards to support. It is only when finally we put in a solid prop, not just a card, that we can stand on its own, and that the whole chain stands. Similarly, beings that cannot supply their own perfection cannot really explain things. For that, we need a being that needs nothing else. The first cause. Now let us try a comparison from astronomy. Most astronomers today favor the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe. There are still some difficulties with it, yet most astronomers favor it. For example, for certain it will give us in illustrations. This theory says that there first was one great ball of matter, then it exploded. As the pans flew farther and farther out, some matter joined in to form stars, planets, and galaxies. Is there good evidence for this theory? If we only had a time machine that would let us look back in time for 1 million years first, then for 5 millions, then for 10 millions, and so on, to observe the state of the universe at these various points, then we could visually check to see if things were as supposed in this theory. Of course, we do not have a time machine, but believe it or not, without one we can still look back in time. Think, for example, of the nearest galaxy to ours, Andromeda. Its distance from us is about 2.2 million light years. Now we know that light races at a speed just over 186 miles per second. So when we say Andromeda is 2.2 million lights away, what we are really saying is it is so far that even at that staggering speed of 186,000 miles per second, its light takes 2.2 million years to reach our eyes. Further, let us notice this, that the light that takes so long to reach us, then the way Andromeda looks to us now, is not the way it really is now we are seeing Andromeda the way it was 2.2 million years ago. But we can really look back in time. Of course, then, we can look at other objects in space and see in each case the state of things many million years back. Let us come back to the start of the theory. There was a giant ball of matter, and it exploded. What brought that ball of matter into existence? It could not just make itself. What made it explode? What could not happen without cause? Therefore, the cause that brought it into existence and made it explode into a great universe is what we call God. But it is time to go further than what even Aristotle could see. When the universe was made out of nothing, how great a rise in the scale of being did that require? If we think of a rise from, let us say, 3 degrees to 7 degrees, we seem to be able to measure that. It seems to be a limited rise. But how great is the rise from utter nothing to something, and moreover to something good? Such a rise is actually infinite. What kind of power does it take to cause an infinite rise? Obviously, infinite power. So God must be infinite. Aristotle would have really enjoyed this added step in this reasoning process. There is still another train of reasoning that brings us face to face with infinity. Aristotle saw that potency is capacity, but he did not notice that it was also a limit. Think of an 8-ounce and 12-ounce glass. Each has the capacity for 8 to 12 ounces, but each also has a limit. It can take no more than 8 or 12 ounces. Now, we saw that the first cause must have no potency. It must be only pure act. If it had a potency, it would have the problem of getting up from potency to act. Now, act without potency is the same as act without limit, for potency is limit. Therefore, act without limit is infinite. And since act is the same as perfection, God is infinite perfection. We can see, too, that God must be unchangeable. But before anything can change, it must have potency, or capacity for change. But he has no potency, so he cannot change. We also see that he must be beyond and outside of time, for time is a restless succession of change. What was future a moment ago changes to present and then to past. But he is incapable of change, so he is beyond time. Hence his life is called eternity in the strict sense. All is present to him, no past, no future. When someone dies, we say in a loose sense that he goes to eternity. But what we really mean is he goes outside of time, yet he certainly still has had a past and will also have a future. So the word eternity is used loosely about a departed one. In the strict sense, the word eternity applies only to God, yet we do say God made the world, an expression of the past, and Christ will return at the end, an expression of the future. But to the infinite mind, these are all present, with no past or future. With these observations, we can begin to suspect the limited capacity of our minds compared to the eternal. Now that we have expressed these things in somewhat technical language, we can reiterate in common terms. Basically, if anything changes, it must first have the capacity, followed by fulfillment. And we can see that when something higher appears as a result of an action, or when something comes into existence, there must be a higher power behind it. Now, where does the extra come from? It might be a pan of the one that changes, but only postpones the reckoning, for that other pan also has to get the extra from somewhere, which means from some being outside itself. But that outside being has the same problem, and so on, and so on, until we get a being with no such problem. That being is the first cause, the source of all being, or God. Again, when the first things come into existence, they came from nothing. Otherwise, they would not be the first. But that ascent from nothing to something is an infinite rise. To cause it takes infinite power. So God has to be infinite. The chariots of the gods theory held by von Daniken and others now seems silly in comparison. They suggest that perhaps long ago astronauts visited the Earth and on the simple Earthlings. Now we cannot deny that such a thing could have happened if the spacemen would overcome the problem of staying alive long enough to come even the nearest heavenly bodies at the speed of light, or could even exceed what seems to be the speed limit in the universe. But even if we could grant the possibility of such visitors, we would still have to ask, who made the astronauts? Who made their world? Who made ours? So our proofs hold, even if there could have been such space visitors. Chapter 5. A Good God versus Great Evils. Some people, in spite of all evidence, say there cannot be a God because there are so many evils in the world. This is not a rational position because emotion is its foundation. For once we have solid proof of something, such as the existence of God, objections, even unanswered ones, cannot destroy what is once proved solid. But we can begin studying this objection now, even though the full answer must wait until we have established by reason what we can and should believe Scripture. We begin by noticing there are two kinds of evil, physical and moral. Physical evils include such things as illness, poverty, losses. Moral evils include all types of sins, such as evils purposely done by human beings. It will be helpful to look at the unusual and inaccurate ideas some people have had about physical evils. In ancient times, the Zoroastrians and the Manichees believed errors which we call dualistic. They reason this way: there are good things in the world, therefore there must be a good God who made them. But there are also evils in the world. Therefore, there must be some other powerful being, not necessarily a God, who made these evils. Thus, in dualism, there are two principles, one good and one evil. Not only in ancient times, but also today, people continue to be fooled by the concept of dualism. To see flaws in this theory, we must ask the question, what is evil? There are three possible answers. First, evil must be either positive or negative. That is, it must be a thing or the absence of a thing. If evil is negative, if it is the absence of a thing, there are two further possibilities. It could be simple or privative, lack. A simple negative is the lack of something that is not really called for, like wings on a cat. The birds are relieved at this. A privative negative is the lack of something that is called for, such as paws on a cat. Now, if we thought, as did the Manichees and the Zoroastrians, and some other unfortunate groups, that evils were positive, then we could literally get a suitable container, fill it up with 100% pure evil, and hang out a danger sign. But there is no thing that is by substance or nature evil. Evil is the absence of something that is necessary. Clearly, therefore, is no God or other powerful being needed to make it, for it is a nothing, a mere lack. God does permit such evils, but what would he have done to stop them? Here we must distinguish between physical and moral evils. A world without physical evils, if a material world, would have been comprised of one miracle after another, simply because material things can go to pieces, can come apart, can slip, as common sense testifies. Now, it is not really rational for God to work miracles routinely, for a miracle is extraordinary, and the extraordinary cannot become ordinary. What of moral evils? That is, those coming from free decisions of men. The question contains the answer. They do come from the free decisions of men. In other words, let us imagine God considering creating a human race. The very decision to make human beings having intellectual and free will entails freedom, and that leaves open the possibility for moral evil. But then moral evil comes from misusing their freedom, not from God. Of course, God permits moral evil, but to stop evil, he would have either to multiply miracles indefinitely, which would be irrational, making the extraordinary ordinary, or he would have to withhold or at least reduce free will. But then he would be contradicting himself, for then he should not have made a human race at all, for a race that is not free is not human. He judged that there was a great good, and there is, in making a race that is free. And so he did, in fact, create a human race. Of course, there is much, much more to say on this topic, but without the aid of Scripture to back up specific points, we can only speculate. You can see at this point in our discussion, we have not proved, however, that one may or should accept Scripture. Let us suppose for a moment, without help from Scripture, that this short life on earth is followed by an unending happy life in heaven, that the evil which we encounter in this earthly existence can be turned into pure gold for the future life, into happiness beyond our greatest dreams. Such a speculation would make a lot of sense. Now, further on, with the help of Scripture, you'll prove it is true. Chapter 6, The Heart of the Matter. We have spent much time on preliminaries, but they are all worthwhile, even necessary, for many readers. Now it is time to examine the positive, reasonable proof that we can, in fact, intellectually cannot help but believe the Catholic Church. How shall we start? There are many approaches, but we will use the best one, the Gospels, to establish the validity of the Church. Immediately someone will argue, you say that we should believe the Church because the Gospels say so, and we should believe the Gospels because the Church says so. This is a vicious circle, like a dog chasing his tail, and you will never prove things that way. We agree and hasten to assure readers that we have no such intention. We will start with the Gospels, yes, but we will not consider them as sacred, inspired, or any such thing. We will look at them merely as documents from ancient times. We will treat them the same way we treat other ancient documents, such as those from Caesar, Livy, Tacitus, and others. And when we see if we can arrive at some fact from them, only after establishing the claims of the Church do we take up the question of whether the Gospels are sacred or inspired. But before we even start our work, we meet with two loud objections that seem very formidable today: historicism and the claim that even eyewitnesses can be trusted. Historicism is the claim that every person event is so unique that we have too little in common with the past to be confident of understanding the past. The consequences are devastating. History of any kind is there put under much doubt. The Gospels cannot be trusted, for the sense of past doctrinal statements of the Church cannot be known with certainty, and therefore contemporary philosophy of history relativizes the past and thus neutralizes it. We are freed from the past. If the past imposes no pattern on us, we are free to try and create the future. Obviously, before we can try to get any facts from the Gospels, we must meet this threat to all history. To start, it is very helpful to go back to almost the beginning of history writing. Herodotus, the early 5th century Greek author of A History of the Persian Wars, is often called the father of history, wrote, "My duty is to report all that is said, but I am not obliged to believe it all alike, a remark which may be understood to apply to my whole history." Later in the same centuries, Thucydides wrote about the Peloponnesian War, in which he himself had been a general. Of the events of the war I have not ventured to speak from any chance information, nor according to any notion of my own. I have described nothing but what I either saw myself or learned from others, whom I made the most careful and particular inquiry, and again, I took great pains to make out the exact truth. We could easily fill many pages with similar statements. We need to notice is that these early writers intended to report facts. Their critical ability and techniques were somewhat less developed than those of modern historians. Yet they did strive to report facts, and did so remarkably well. A later Roman historian, Tacitus, is judged by most scholars to be almost the equal of a modern writer in reporting facts. Besides reporting facts, these Greek and Roman writers added interpretations. Can we tell fact from an interpretation? Historians have no doubt or problem that, in general, we mentioned this point since, oddly, some scripture scholars today say we cannot distinguish the same two elements in the Gospels. Let us take two examples to show concretely how we can distinguish fact from interference. Tacitus writes in his Annals, Tiberius, right after the death of Augustus, when Tiberius was to become emperor, only showed signs of hesitation when he addressed the Senate. This was chiefly because Germanicus, who was extremely popular, Tiberius was afraid of Germanicus, might prefer the throne to the prospect of it. Notice the hesitant manner of speaking and acting with Tiberius used at the time. This manner was a physical fact, readily visible to countless witnesses. We can assume that Tiberius feared to speak too fast for fear of provoking Germanicus to make a move for the throne. This is, of course, an interpretation. It tries to read the mind of Tiberius. If Tiberius had explicitly said such was his motive, it would have been a physically observable fact, but he did not. Tacitus was just trying to infer this. The inference may or may not have been correct. In Luke chapter 10, verse 30 to 37, we have the story of a man who went to Jerusalem, to Jericho, was beaten and left half dead by the road. Again, we distinguish two components. One, the simple physical fact that he was found half dead at the roadside after having been beaten. Two, the interpretation. What was the motive? Robbery, senseless violence, revenge. The Gospel tells us he was robbed. Had it not provided that information, we might still not have been sure of the interpretation of the beating. As we can see, we can easily distinguish between two kinds of materials. We have stressed this because historicists seem to forget it, and so they focus their attention entirely on the second item, interpretation, forgetting the first, the simple physical facts. It is true that it is often difficult to determine the interpretation of a past event, especially if it involves customs, beliefs, or attitudes of a culture different from ours. We may find it hard to reconstruct the picture with certainty, although it often enough can be done. Thus, for example, it is impossible by careful detective work to recapture the almost lost ancient concept of Hesed in the Old Testament. With regard to physical facts, anyone, no matter what his cultural background, customs, or beliefs, can observe them. So the historicists have made a serious mistake at the outset of forgetting this obvious distinction. Historicism developed as an equal and opposite pendulum reaction. J. Bossuet, in his Discourse of Universal History, in 1681, claimed that divine providence is so all-pervasive in the course of history that it directs events even to goals in this world. Now, of course, there is a measure of truth in this. Providence does not affect events. But Bossuet exaggerated much. Next, the minute of the so-called Enlightenment and the positivists, chiefly in the 18th century, had similar beliefs. They did not appeal to divine providence, but they thought that there was much pattern in the course of history, that we could treat history like the experimental sciences, that is, find law, make hypothesis, and thus be able to predict many things and even have much control over events. This was another great exaggeration. In about 1810, G.F.W. Hegel a philosopher, introduced the theory that all history could be found to be in clusters of three stages: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That is, someone takes a position, someone else takes the opposite stand, and the interaction leads to a third position. Again, there is much truth in this, but not everything fits so tightly. As we said, the equal and opposite reaction had to come. Historicists began to deny all pattern and thus contend that each person and each event is so unique that we have not enough in common to understand them in relation to each other. Again, they have measure of truth, but they failed to distinguish mere physical events from interpretations. Culture, customs, and beliefs do not affect one's perception of simple physical events, though they do, as we said, create difficulties of varying degrees of making interpretations. But, for our purpose, to lay the groundwork for faith, we need only physical facts from the Gospels, very few of them, very simple ones, as we shall see. Hence, the worries of the historicists do not affect us. In fact, at the conclusion of our work, we find it very simple to make an end run around the claims of historicists. Further, the historicists are wrong in refusing to recognize that there are many patterns in people's lives and in events. Anthropologists tell us primitive people have much the same moral codes as we have, though how well they keep them can be another question. Their codes are similar to our 10 Commandments. Medical doctors describe standard reactions among their patients. So do psychologists. Ascetical and mystical theologians likewise can point to large general patterns in the way people grow in the spiritual life. Even the old schools of biology, that is said, there are 4 kinds of temperaments in people, though based on inaccurate biology, turn out to give a fine description of the basic groups of tendencies and behavior. Sociologists, too, can give us large groupings of attitudes and conduct. And even in the everyday simple matters of what kind of exercise one likes, or what kinds of food one prefers, or one's taste in the fine arts, there are large groupings among people. So while there are many individual differences, there are also extensive and numerous patterns which help us much, even in the interpretation of things. So the historicists have not proved anything that would prevent us from using the few simple physical facts we need from the Gospels for a basis of faith. Still, we have a lot of things to work out before we ask the Gospels for these, but we can use them, and we will use them. We said that doubts have been raised today about even the validity of eyewitnesses. Experiments done on eyewitnesses have raised some questions about how much we can depend on even them to report facts. In one experiment, students were shown a film of a multiple car accident, then given 22 questions to answer. There were divergences on the answers to the one question, "Did you see a broken headlight?" In another experiment, a news magazine printed several copies of pennies of slightly different, and people were asked to pitch one that matched the actual penny. Of course, there were differences in answers in both experiments, but the experimenters forgot to make necessary distinctions, the usual root of errors in solving such problems. They did not notice 2 factors that affect the outcome: motive and opportunity. In both cases, there was little motive for the witnesses to remember. Sure, we do not pay attention to the precise wording on pennies and other similar details about them. there is no point in doing so. As to the car accident, accidents happen so suddenly, and usually when the witnesses are not looking, or if looking, are not paying attention. The opportunity to see is very brief, very sudden. So it was easy for them to fail to note things as whether or not a headlight was broken. Plus, they had small motive to watch carefully. But consider a case in which there is high motivation and high opportunity. Suppose, to take a wild example, a spaceship really landed in the parking lot of a large shopping center. People would not only hear it coming down, but would be unable to take their eyes off of it as the door opens and some odd little people emerged. Yes, their emotions might make some details confused, even then. But the big basic fact that a spaceship landed and odd people came out, no one could possibly fail to get that right. Similarly, with the gospel miracles, if a man says to a leper, "Be made clean," and instantly he is cured, if he ordered a blind man to see, the onlookers would not forget these basic facts, even though they might disagree on unimportant details. They had ample opportunity and strong motive to remember. What about the man himself who was healed? Would he not get it straight? And other things about Jesus, too? Of course, he could not help it. But now, and this is really remarkable, we happen to have an early writer, Quadratus, writing about 123 AD, who tells us that in his time, people healed by Christ and even raised from the dead by him were still around. What powerful witnesses such people make. And we will quote Quadratus at the end of chapter 11. For the time being, we are not trying positively to prove that the Gospels are reliable. We are just doing preliminary work, clearing away possible obstacles or objections that would say we cannot trust any history or any eyewitnesses. Chapter 7, A Faithful Text. Let us imagine St. Luke sitting down to write, or to dictate, his Gospel. Do we have the copy he wrote? Definitely not. There is no ancient work whatsoever for which we have the original copy or autograph. How close are we? In the case of pagan works, a gap of 9 to 10 centuries between the autograph and our oldest manuscript is not unusual. For example, the oldest manuscript of Caesar's work on the Civil War, written in the middle of the 1st century BC, comes from the 10th century AD. But in the case of the Gospels, we can do far better. The oldest complete copies we possess of the New Testament are the Vatican and Sinai codices, each dating from around 350 AD, far closer than the spread that exists for Caesar's work. We also have the Alexandrian Codex and the Codex Bezae from the early 400s AD. But we can do something to narrow even this small gap. We have papyri giving parts of the New Testament. Thus, the papyrus is called P. The Chester Beatty Papyrus, too, comes from the early 200s AD. It includes most of the epistles of St. Paul. Then there are several Bodmer papyri. P comes from around 200 AD and has parts of Luke and John. P, from the same period, has parts of John. P has the epistle of Jude and the 2 epistles of Peter. Oldest of all is the P, the Rylands Papyrus, 457, which has only 4 verses from John 18, but dates from 135 AD. We also have other checks on the state of the text from old translations. The Old Syriac and Old Latin versions are earlier than the papyri in general, comes from the late 100s AD. The Coptic and Sahedric translations date from the early 200s AD. Thus, examine the state of that text early. Besides, the fathers of the church in the early centuries often quoted scripture, so we can see what their copies were like. Sometimes, of course, they sometimes quoted from memory, not precisely word for word, but even then, the substance is surely correct. Really, no scholar at all worries about whether our text of the Gospels is accurate or not, for with extremely few exceptions, the differences between the one manuscript and the others are trifling. Even those differences that are larger have no bearing on the essential facts that we need to build the foundation for faith. So we do not, strictly speaking, have to take up this subject at all. Yet, for the sake of completeness and thoroughness, we want to continue in this vein. There is a whole science that deals with the question of faithful transmission of texts. It is called Textual Criticism. We will not go through every aspect of it here. We will examine only some major points. Let us again picture a scriptural author writing or dictating his gospel. Printing was centuries away, of course, so copies had to be made by hand from that autograph. We do not know how many were made of that first copy. Let us imagine, for the sake of illustration, that the 3 copies were made. Now, when we copy even our own compositions, it is not unusual for us to make small mistakes in copying. So it is likely that the first scribes did that too. Further, it is not likely that the identical errors would be found in each of the 3 copies. From each of the 3 copies, others were made by hand. Let us imagine a half-dozen from each. These further copies would be apt to reproduce the slips of the copies from which they were made, or to add slips of their own, and so on, into further copies from copies. The result is that there must have been, as it were, a family tree of manuscripts. The trunk represents the autograph. From the trunk comes the 3 great branches. From the 3 come smaller branches, and so on. From what we said at the start of the chapter, we can gather that there must be a water line. In other words, we could draw a line, perhaps horizontal, through this tree. We do have all manuscripts above the line. We have none of those below the line. When we try to figure out which manuscripts belong to which larger branches, for if 2 or 3 merely copy one previous manuscript, their testimony in this respect carries no more weight than a single branch from which they come. Therefore, to judge the correct reading, we cannot merely count manuscripts. We must try to reconstruct the family tree to see which manuscripts carry the greater weight or seems more reliable. In doing this, of course, we look for small mistakes that are common to different manuscripts or for other types of common characteristics, so as to find the family traits. Scholars today think the text found in the Vatican and Sinai manuscripts is, on the whole, the best. After selecting the best family of manuscripts, we need to pick between the variations within them. There are many principles used for that. Let us mention just 2 that are especially important. Suppose that we have three variant readings at the one spot one must pick. Clearly, if one of the three can more readily provide a ground or a common base from which others could have been derived, that one is more to be likely the original reading. Second, we do well to pick that reading which best agrees with known habits and tendencies of the author. We could go into greater detail, but as we said, there is no need to work further here. All scholars agree that nearly all the variations we find in the Gospels are so tiny and insignificant that it is agreed that a good 90% of the text is above suspicion and does accurately give the sense of the original. Those parts that do leave doubt are such that are not needed for our work of building the foundation of faith. As we shall soon see, for that we need only a half-dozen very simple facts, physical facts, which are completely unaffected by the variance.